On a sharp autumn morning in the middle of October 1944, when the air carried the bite of approaching winter mixed with the heavy scent of ocean brine, a vessel bearing the name Bremen made its slow approach toward the naval installation at Norfolk. The ship had crossed the Atlantic over several weeks, its hull showing the wear of the journey in streaks of corrosion that marked the grey steel. Standing on the deck, bundled in coats that offered little protection against the wind coming off the water, were 47 women who had been taken prisoner during the collapse of German positions across France and Belgium, along with others captured within the crumbling borders of the Reich itself. These women had spent their journey listening to the reassurances of officers and the echoes of propaganda that had followed them since childhood, all of it insisting that the nation they were approaching was fundamentally weak, a place where comfort had rotted away any capacity for serious warfare. The moment the ship settled into its berth and the walkway was lowered to connect vessel to shore, that entire framework of belief began to crack apart before their eyes. Sound hit them first. The harbour was not quiet, not even close. Everywhere around them rose the noise of metal striking metal, the rhythmic pounding of hammers against ship hulls, creating a percussion that seemed almost ceremonial in its steadiness. Diesel motors coughed and rumbled, sending up columns of dark smoke as massive cranes swung cargo containers the size of small houses through the air and onto waiting railway flat cars. The smell of the place overwhelmed the senses in a way that spoke of plenty rather than deprivation. Hot tar mixed with lubricating grease, the sharp tang of heated steel blending with the salt spray from the harbour. For women who had spent years watching their homeland slowly starve itself of resources, rationing everything from bread to soap, the sheer abundance was almost violent in its impact. One among them, a woman called Ingrid, who kept a careful diary throughout her captivity, would write later that evening about how they had prepared themselves to encounter emptiness and found instead a port more crowded with vessels than Hamburg had been in the height of its peacetime prosperity. The contradiction could not have been more stark or more immediate. These prisoners, many of them trained as technicians or support personnel with real understanding of logistics and production, had expected to set foot in a society hollowed out by war. Instead, before they had even walked down the gangplank onto American territory, the evidence of a war-making apparatus beyond anything they had imagined surrounded them on all sides. The naval yard at Norfolk employed more than 40,000 people at that point in the war, men and women working around the clock, launching what they called Liberty ships with such regularity that a new one slid into the water every 4 days. By the time the war ended, American shipyards across the nation would produce well over 2,000 of these vessels alone, a number that exceeded Germany's entire wartime maritime output. A lieutenant from the United States Navy, his uniform crisp and his manner carrying that particular blend of formality and casual civility that seemed characteristically American, escorted the women down the walkway. His tone was professional but not hostile, showing neither gloating nor warmth, and somehow that quiet correctness added to the growing unease settling over the prisoners. The sound of their boots on the wooden planks of the dock seemed loud despite all the industrial noise around them, and their eyes moved constantly, trying to take in the impossible scope of what they were seeing. Rows of soldiers stood at ease nearby, not threatening but present, and behind them stretched an endless backdrop of cranes, cargo nets hanging like massive spiderwebs, and vessels in various stages of completion. The silence among the German women felt heavy, broken only by the shuffling of feet and the relentless percussion of shipyard machinery that never seemed to pause even for a moment. For the Americans managing this arrival, this was nothing special, just another routine intake of prisoners among thousands. For the women coming down that gangplank, it was the first tremor of a revelation that would only grow stronger. The very atmosphere seemed charged with movement and with power that did not need to announce itself because it was simply everywhere. They began noticing details that piled up into a crushing weight of evidence. A convoy of military trucks sat idling not far away, their fuel tanks obviously full, their canvas covers new and unstained. Stacks of fresh uniforms, piled waist-high on wooden pallets, sat waiting for distribution. To people who had been stretching rations of soap and sugar since the early years of the war, these were not just supplies, but symbols of a capacity so far beyond their own nation's reach that it bordered on the incomprehensible. One prisoner whispered to another in German, her voice barely audible, that it could not be possible, that what they were seeing could not be real. Another pulled her scarf more tightly around her neck, as though she could protect herself against something more dangerous than the October chill. What made it all more unsettling was the obvious fact that none of this had been staged for their benefit. This was not a tour designed to intimidate prisoners or a propaganda exercise meant to break their spirits. This was simply how things functioned in this place, the ordinary daily rhythm of American wartime life, and that ordinariness disturbed them more profoundly than any deliberate show of force could have managed. A representative from the Red Cross, present to ensure the prisoners received treatment consistent with international agreements, made a note in his records that the women appeared less disoriented by their capture than by their arrival, as though the docks themselves communicated a form of power that transcended the force of weapons. As the German prisoners were guided toward the buses that would take them inland, they caught one final view of the horizon, where ship masts and industrial smokestacks rose into the grey sky like a forest made entirely of iron. None of them would forget that image, but they could not yet know that this was merely the beginning of their education. The journey ahead would take them deeper into the industrial heartland of the United States, past evidence even more staggering than what they had witnessed at the Norfolk docks, and with every mile they travelled, the gap between what they had been taught to believe and what they were now witnessing with their own eyes would grow wider and more impossible to ignore or explain away. The convoy of buses, painted in that distinctive olive colour the American military seemed to use for everything, rolled away from Norfolk shortly after midday, flanked by a pair of military jeeps that served as escort. The buses rattled along the coastal highway, their windows still streaked with dried salt spray from the harbour air, and inside, the German women sat in a silence that felt almost oppressive, their attention pulled irresistibly toward everything passing outside those grimy windows. They had prepared themselves to encounter scarcity and collapse, the kind of desperation they had been told characterized a nation unable to sustain a real war effort. Instead, mile after mile, America revealed itself as something else entirely, an arsenal that seemed to have no end, a machine that produced war materials with a casualness that defied everything they thought they understood about modern conflict. The first shock arrived within minutes of leaving the harbour area behind. Shipyards stretched away from the road for what seemed like entire city blocks, smoke and steam rising from the construction gantries, where workers sent cascades of sparks into the grey afternoon air. Rows upon rows of Liberty ships stood in various stages of assembly, some nothing more than skeletal frameworks of ribs and plates, others nearly complete and ready for their launch into the water. Among the prisoners sat a young woman who had served as a signals officer and had spent considerable time studying naval tonnage tables as part of her duties. She leaned toward the window and whispered, her voice shaking slightly, that a single yard in this place was producing more hull tonnage than all of Kiel combined. The numbers, when examined later, would prove her observation accurate. Norfolk alone was churning out dozens of destroyers, aircraft carriers, and support vessels throughout 1944, and across the nation as a whole, United States shipyards were producing 18 million tons of shipping every year, roughly 6 times the entire wartime output of Germany. The rhythm of those hammers and rivet guns echoed through the windows of the moving bus like an industrial heartbeat that never faltered, never slowed, never seemed to tire. As the convoy pushed inland, the landscape transformed from docks and shipyards to factories and manufacturing plants. Smokestacks punctured the horizon in every direction, and warehouses sprawled across acres of land, their walls stenciled with company names that the women recognized only vaguely from intelligence reports and intercepted documents. Ford, DuPont, Bethlehem Steel. One of the prisoners would remember years later that it felt as though every town they passed through was actually a military barracks, every street a supply route, and in that moment she realized with absolute clarity that their own newspapers had been feeding them lies. This was not a soft people distracted by creature comforts and unwilling to make sacrifices. This was a nation completely mobilized for war, a society that had turned its entire productive capacity toward a single purpose and was doing so with an efficiency that made German efforts look amateurish by comparison. The paradox deepened with every mile the buses covered. Even the roads themselves seemed to be part of the revelation. The highways carried constant streams of trucks loaded with wooden crates, armoured vehicles, and spare parts. Gasoline, which had become so scarce in Germany that doctors were riding bicycles to make their rounds at hospitals, flowed freely here, fueling this ceaseless motion of men and materials. The women could smell it whenever the convoy slowed, that sharp, sweet odour of petrol fumes clinging to the warm autumn air. One of the drivers, a sergeant named James Foster, actually chuckled when he overheard one of the prisoners gasp at the sight of hundreds of trucks lined up nose to tail at a depot they passed. He muttered under his breath too quietly for the interpreter to catch that what she was looking at was not even half of what was on the roads at any given time. For him, this was mundane reality. For the prisoners, it was unthinkable abundance. At a rest stop somewhere outside Newport News, the buses pulled over to idle beside a massive rail yard. Long lines of boxcars and flatbed carriers stood ready for loading, each one stamped with white chalk marks indicating destinations scattered across the continent. Pittsburgh, Chicago, St. Louis. Cranes lifted crates marked with serial numbers, and the sheer orderliness of the entire operation left the women feeling unsettled in a way that was difficult to articulate. Back in the Reich, chaos had become the norm. Bombing raids disrupted shipments constantly, shortages forced improvisation at every level, and the entire logistics system seemed to be held together by desperation and willpower. Here, everything moved with clean efficiency, relentless and apparently unstoppable. The prisoners exchanged glances, communicating without words, silently taking stock of what they were witnessing. Several among them were trained analysts whose value to Berlin had been tied to their ability to read production capacity from small details, and what they saw in the frequency of trains, the volume of materials being moved, the neat stockpiling of goods. All of it suggested an enemy whose resources dwarfed their own to a degree that was almost embarrassing. One of them pulled out a small notebook and scribbled something that would be recovered years later during post-war interviews. She had written that they had been taught to think of America as a land of consumers, but it was instead a land of producers, and every factory they passed was another nail being driven into the coffin of the Reich. And yet, paradoxically, nobody seemed to be flaunting any of this abundance. American civilians along the route simply went about their lives as the convoy passed. Workers in coveralls walked to their shifts, children played by the roadside, women carried groceries home from shops. There was no sense of strain visible anywhere, none of the hollow-eyed exhaustion that had become the defining characteristic of German cities by 1944. Instead, vitality seemed to spill from the streets themselves, an energy that suggested a population still well-fed, still adequately clothed, still building highways and bridges, as though peace had never been interrupted. The prisoners could not reconcile what they were seeing with what they had been told. Here was a nation waging global war on multiple fronts while still feeding its people, still clothing them properly, still maintaining its infrastructure, and somehow doing all of this without the kind of total mobilization that had ground German civilian life down to bare survival. By the time the convoy approached Richmond as evening shadows began to lengthen, the women had fallen completely silent. The shock of the harbour had given way to something deeper and more corrosive, a gnawing realization that what they had witnessed in a single afternoon surpassed what Germany could produce in a year. Their faith in the propaganda, in the notion that America was soft and incapable and divided, was dissolving like morning frost under the Virginia sun. But their journey was far from finished. Ahead lay the camps themselves, the processing centres where, in another paradox, their captors would treat them with a dignity and level of care they had not expected and certainly had not been prepared for. And in that treatment, yet another revelation awaited them, one that would force them to confront uncomfortable truths about their own nation and its conduct of the war. The buses turned off the main road as dusk settled over the countryside, their tyres crunching on gravel as they approached a sprawling compound surrounded by barbed wire fencing. The women braced themselves internally, expecting filth and overcrowding and brutality. German propaganda had painted American prisoner of war camps as little better than open cages where men and women were left to suffer in squalid conditions. But as the gates swung open to admit the convoy, another paradox revealed itself with jarring clarity. The barracks that lay before them looked nothing like a prison camp. If anything, they resembled a college campus, or perhaps a well-maintained military training facility. Neat rows of wooden buildings stood in orderly lines, their roofs recently tarred against the weather, smoke curling from chimneys and carrying with it the unmistakable scent of fresh bread from a nearby mess hall. Beyond the immediate barracks area stretched tidy gardens and an open field marked with lines for recreational sports. One woman among them, a nurse named Hildegard, who had served near the front lines and seen her share of military facilities, muttered that it was impossible, that prisoners here were apparently living better than German soldiers currently fighting at the front. Inside the processing centre, the shock only deepened. Each prisoner was assigned an identification number, photographed for the records, and issued fresh bedding that smelled of soap and sunlight. Then came the medical inspection, conducted by a Navy physician named Dr. Elizabeth Crawford, whose manner was brisk and professional, but not unkind. She checked teeth, listened to lungs with a stethoscope, and noted signs of malnutrition in nearly every case she examined. Through an interpreter, she told one of the women that they had been living on perhaps 1,200 calories daily, maybe less, while American servicemen were receiving twice that amount even when stationed in combat zones. For the Germans, the contrast was humiliating in a way that was hard to articulate. Back home, rations had dwindled over the years to thin slices of black bread, ersatz coffee that tasted more like burned grain than anything resembling real coffee, and watery stews that left stomachs still empty. Here, even prisoners were being measured for properly fitting shoes and vaccinated against disease. Ingrid, still keeping her careful diary, wrote that evening that their captors were treating them like patients rather than enemies, and she found herself unable to decide whether this was an insult or a mercy, or somehow both at the same time. The paradox did not end with food or medical care. That first evening, the women were led to their assigned barracks where clean cots waited, each with wool blankets that actually provided warmth. Soap and towels were stacked in neat piles beside the washroom facilities, and everything was clean in a way that seemed almost aggressive in its contrast to what they had left behind. A representative from the Red Cross explained through the interpreter that under the Geneva Convention, prisoners were entitled to basic standards of dignity and care. The German women stared in disbelief because their own government had signed those same conventions, yet Soviet and French prisoners held in camps throughout the Reich were starving in open fields, sleeping in mud when they slept at all. The numbers tell this story with brutal clarity. In American prisoner of war camps, German captives received an average of 3,500 calories every day, which was more than many American civilians were getting during rationing. In German camps, Allied prisoners often starved on fewer than 1,000 calories daily, their bodies wasting away while their captors looked on with indifference or worse. One prisoner confessed in a hushed tone to another that if anyone back in Berlin knew the truth about how well they were surviving here, they would never be forgiven for it. The sensory details of that first night etched themselves into memory with uncomfortable permanence. The smell of clean sheets, something most of them had not experienced in months. The taste of white bread and butter at supper, luxuries that had vanished from German tables years ago. The gentle clatter of stainless steel cutlery, such a small thing but somehow significant. All of it added up to a kind of abundance that felt almost obscene given the circumstances. In one corner of the mess hall, a prisoner broke down in tears after biting into an orange, a fruit she had not seen since before the war began. She whispered to the woman beside her that to them this was luxury beyond any reasonable expectation, a level of plenty that seemed impossible for prisoners of war. Yet the treatment was not simple indulgence or kindness for its own sake. It was discipline of a different kind. The guards maintained order firmly, and any attempt at escape would not have been tolerated. But the civility itself functioned as its own kind of weapon, a subtle demonstration of American confidence and capacity. As one of the United States officers remarked to a colleague, they could afford to treat prisoners well because they were not afraid of them, not worried that showing humanity would somehow weaken their position or undermine the war effort. The women lay awake that first night in the barracks, listening to the low hum of a generator somewhere outside and the distant barking of guard dogs on patrol. For some of them, it was the first uninterrupted night of rest they had experienced in months, the first time in recent memory they had slept without fear of bombing raids or artillery. For others, it was a different kind of torment, because being shown humanity by the enemy made it harder to justify the brutality of their own side, harder to maintain the certainty that had sustained them through years of war. But what they had seen so far, the harbour with its endless ships, the highways crowded with trucks, the barracks that looked like college dormitories, all of it was only scratching the surface of America's real power. Soon they would hear something that would disorient them even further. Voices crackling across open radios and telephone lines, revealing a war effort coordinated across vast distances with a reach that seemed to defy the imagination and mock the Reich's obsession with secrecy. The morning routine in the camp began with roll call, the bugle cutting sharp and clear through the autumn air. After breakfast, which consisted of eggs and toast and hot coffee that tasted like genuine luxury rather than the bitter substitutes they had grown accustomed to, the prisoners were escorted into a common hall for what the Americans called orientation. There, for the first time since their capture, they heard something they had been taught could not exist in any functional form: the open pulse of American communications, unguarded and flowing freely. Radios hummed with static and clear voices. Telephones rang constantly, their bells cutting through the low murmur of conversation. The steady clatter of typewriters filled the air, creating a rhythm that spoke of bureaucracy functioning at massive scale. For women who had been trained in signal work, in radar operations, in logistics and communications, the soundscape itself was a revelation that challenged everything they thought they understood about how modern warfare functioned. They leaned forward in their chairs, ears sharpened by training, trying to catch what was being said through the static of a shortwave radio set positioned near the front of the hall. Weather updates were coming through from Kansas, shipping manifests being read aloud from New Orleans, naval traffic reports from somewhere off the Pacific coast. The astonishing part was not just the breadth of information flowing through these channels, but how unguarded it all seemed, how casual. One of the Germans, a former radio operator named Lotte, who understood more English than most, whispered to the woman beside her that they did not even bother to encrypt or hide most of it, that they were broadcasting openly to the world because they could afford to do so. In the Reich, secrecy had been everything, an obsession that governed every transmission. Lines were constantly monitored for enemy taps, codes were layered and cloaked, paranoia shaped every communication decision. Here, the openness was both confusing and absolutely terrifying in its implications. A United States Army sergeant noticed the women's rapt attention and explained casually, in broken German supplemented by hand gestures, that this was just routine daily business, nothing special. He told them that they had thousands of radio stations, thousands of telephone lines, connecting every state, every military base, every ship at sea, all of them part of one vast interconnected network. He shrugged as though describing something completely unremarkable, but for the prisoners, the scale was staggering. Germany's communications networks, fragmented by constant bombing and crippled by shortages of copper wire and vacuum tubes, could barely maintain reliable contact across its shrinking empire. Connections dropped constantly, static made transmissions nearly useless, and the whole system seemed held together by the technical skill of individual operators rather than any coherent infrastructure. The prisoners were even allowed to send letters home under Red Cross supervision, following the international agreements governing treatment of prisoners of war. Some of them dictated messages to clerks who typed them on clean white stationery using actual typewriters that worked properly. Ingrid recorded in her journal that being able to touch a telephone, to see a letter carried freely without fear of it being lost or destroyed in transit, felt like touching civilization again after years of barbarism. And yet, she wrote, this freedom and orderliness was exactly what they had been taught to despise as weakness, as the kind of softness that would doom a nation in total war. The paradox cut deep. The generosity of their captors, the efficiency of American systems, all of it highlighted the bankruptcy of their own regime's promises and claims. The sensory experience reinforced the lesson in ways that went beyond mere observation. The steady buzz of switchboards being operated by skilled personnel, the metallic snap of plugs being inserted and removed as calls were routed across the continent, the constant whir of teletype machines feeding paper through their mechanisms, printing news and orders and reports that would be distributed within hours. It was a symphony of efficiency, and the women began to realize that this invisible infrastructure was as decisive a weapon as any tank or airplane. Wars were not fought only with rifles and explosives. They were won with coordination, with the ability to move information as efficiently as you moved troops. And in that arena, America's advantage was so overwhelming that it barely seemed like a fair contest. Hildegard, the nurse, would confess decades later in a post-war interview that she had believed America was fundamentally disorganized, lazy in the way wealthy nations often became, lacking the discipline that hardship imposed. Instead, she saw that even their voices had order, that the war lived in every telephone line and every radio wave, inescapable and all-encompassing. But what unsettled them most was that the Americans were not showing off, not trying to impress their prisoners or intimidate them with displays of capability. To the staff running these communications systems, this was routine administration, just another day's work. The very normalcy of it rattled the prisoners more than any theatrical demonstration of power could have managed. If this was the background noise of a single prisoner of war camp in Virginia, what must the full network sound like when you scaled it up to include the entire continental United States, all its territories, all its forces deployed across the globe? That evening, as the women returned to their barracks under a sky streaked with clouds, the paradox weighed heavily on their minds. They had been captured soldiers expecting humiliation and harsh treatment. Instead, they were being given glimpses of a system so vast and so efficient that it seemed almost casual in its power. For the Reich, secrecy had always been armor, a way to protect weakness and hide limitations. For America, transparency was strength, because when you had this much capacity, this much productive power, there was no need to hide anything. And soon, the proof of that strength would become even more visible and undeniable. Their next journey would take them into aircraft hangars, where the scale of American air power, measured not in whispers and signals, but in steel wings and roaring engines, would shatter whatever illusions still remained. The first thing that hit them when they entered the hangar was the smell, thick enough to coat the back of the throat. Oil and rubber and gasoline mixing together into a scent so strong that it clung to their clothes long after they left the building. The convoy of buses had pulled up alongside an enormous corrugated structure, its doors yawning open wide enough to swallow freight trains. Inside, wings gleamed under banks of overhead lamps, engines hung suspended from massive cranes, and teams of mechanics swarmed over fuselages with a precision that looked almost choreographed, like dancers who had practiced the same routine 1,000 times. For the German women, most of whom had been raised on stories of Luftwaffe superiority and the technological edge that German engineering supposedly provided, the sight delivered another shock to their crumbling worldview. In their minds, German aircraft like the Messerschmitt and the Junkers and the Focke-Wulf were still the best in the world, still unmatched for quality and performance. Yet here stood rows of American bombers and fighters, not hidden away in carefully guarded facilities, but out in the open by the dozens, perhaps by the hundreds, and nobody seemed to think this required any special security or protection. A sergeant named Michael O'Brien, tasked with escorting the prisoners through the facility, walked them down the length of the hangar floor with the easy confidence of someone who did this kind of work every day. He was a cheerful man, Irish-American based on his accent and his name, with grease stains on his sleeves and absolutely no sense that he was revealing anything remarkable or sensitive. He stopped beside a B-24 Liberator, slapping its fuselage with the flat of his hand like you might pat a horse, and explained through the interpreter that this particular model could be replaced within 3 days if it was lost in combat. 3 days, he emphasized, looking at the women to make sure they understood. That was how fast American factories could turn them out, how quickly they could fill any gap in their numbers. The words landed heavier than any bomb dropped from those aircraft could have. 3 days. In Germany, aircraft factories were being systematically destroyed by Allied bombing raids, spare parts had become desperately scarce, engines often took weeks to assemble when materials could be found at all, and sometimes planes had to be cannibalized just to keep others flying. Here, the idea that a lost bomber was simply a line item on a production schedule, something to be replaced as routinely as you might restock a warehouse, staggered them beyond words. The numbers supported what O'Brien was casually telling them. In 1944 alone, the United States would produce 96,000 aircraft, more than Germany had built during the entire war up to that point. At peak production, a new airplane was rolling off American assembly lines somewhere in the country every 5 minutes of every day. The contrast was so extreme that it bordered on the obscene. The sensory details of the hangar made the revelation impossible to dismiss or rationalize away. The rhythmic pounding of rivet guns echoed through the vast space like sustained machine gun fire, except instead of destroying things, this noise was building power. The air shimmered with heat from arc welders working on metal joints, and the temperature inside the hangar was noticeably warmer than outside, despite the autumn weather. Mechanics shouted to one another over the roar of engines being test-fired, their voices carrying an easy camaraderie that spoke of confidence and routine rather than desperation. The very floor of the building vibrated with the force of all this industry happening simultaneously. Lotte, the radio operator who had already seen so much, muttered in German that there were so many aircraft here and still more coming off the lines every day. Her voice trembled, but not from fear of the guards or concern about her own safety. She was trembling from the sheer realization of what this meant, the implications for the war and for Germany's chances of survival. Hildegard, the nurse, would confess in her journal that evening that their leaders had told them America was weak, that it was a nation unwilling to sacrifice or endure hardship. Yet here, sacrifice was invisible because it was not needed. This was production, not desperation, abundance, rather than the kind of tooth-and-nail struggle that had defined German war industry for years now. What struck them most powerfully was how casual it all seemed. Workers joked with each other during breaks, shared cigarettes, wiped sweat from their brows as though assembling aircraft capable of destroying cities was just another day's labour, no different than working in an automobile factory in peacetime. To the Germans, who had been told repeatedly that every German worker was pressed to their absolute limit, working until exhaustion every single day to support the war effort, this ease was profoundly unnerving. How could a people who seemed so relaxed, so unburdened, produce such overwhelming force? O'Brien, noticing the awe written plainly on their faces, leaned closer to the interpreter with a grin and told him to pass along a message. He said they should see Detroit if they thought this hangar was impressive, because what they were looking at here was nothing more than a drop in the bucket, a tiny fraction of American productive capacity. He chuckled as he walked away, leaving the women standing in silence, trying to process what they had just been told. The paradox hung in the air as thick as the smell of oil and gasoline. For the Reich, every aircraft lost was a small tragedy. a blow to morale and to capability that might take months to recover from. For America, it was an inconvenience that would be remedied within days, maybe a week at most. That difference alone signalled the inevitable trajectory of the war more clearly than any battle report or strategic analysis could have done. As the women were led back outside into the sunlight, the roar of an engine being test-fired shook the ground beneath their feet, the sound following them onto the buses and rattling in their bones like some kind of prophecy written in thunder and fire. But their education in American power was still not finished. In the weeks ahead, they would be shown something even harder to deny or explain away. Photographs and written reports documenting American bombing campaigns, proof that this industrial might was not merely theoretical or defensive, but was actively reaching deep into the heart of the Reich, systematically dismantling the foundations of German war-making capacity, one factory and one rail junction at a time. 3 weeks passed in the prisoner of war camp, settling into a strange kind of limbo defined by routine. Meals arrived at regular times, medical staff conducted checkups, and the prisoners were allowed supervised recreation periods. By this point, the German women no longer jumped at the sound of American trucks pulling up outside or the sharp bark of orders being given in English. But the moment that would alter their understanding most profoundly did not come from anything they saw with their own eyes in the camp or on their journey. It came from what they were shown on paper, in photographs that spoke truths propaganda could not erase. One morning, they were gathered in a small hall where intelligence officers from the United States Army had spread photographs across long wooden tables. The images were black and white, sharp in their clarity and devastating in their content. They showed German cities photographed from high altitude, industrial facilities before and after bombing raids, rail junctions reduced to twisted metal and shattered concrete, synthetic fuel plants cracked open like eggs dropped on stone floors. One officer, speaking in measured tones with the help of an interpreter, tapped a photograph showing the Lohner Works near Merseburg and explained that this facility had produced most of Germany's aviation fuel. Or rather, he corrected himself, it used to produce fuel before the raids. The image placed beside it showed nothing but twisted steel, shattered pipelines, and plumes of smoke frozen in mid-rise by the camera's shutter. The women leaned over the photographs in complete silence, their eyes moving from image to image, trying to absorb what they were seeing. They had been told repeatedly by Nazi broadcasts that Allied bombing was random and clumsy and largely ineffective, that it killed civilians but barely scratched Germany's industrial capacity. Yet here was evidence of something entirely different: precision, calculation, relentless systematic destruction. One photograph after another reinforced the same terrible point. A ball-bearing manufacturing plant in Schweinfurt reduced to rubble so complete that it was difficult to tell what the building had once been. Bridges across the Rhine snapped like matchsticks, their massive stone supports crumbling into the water. Rail yards in Cologne so thoroughly cratered that the earth itself looked like the surface of the moon. A prisoner named Marta whispered, almost to herself rather than to anyone nearby, that this explained why their trains never ran on schedule anymore, why supplies never arrived when they were supposed to, why everything back home had become so chaotic and unpredictable. The statistics confirmed what the pictures showed. By mid-1944, Allied bombers were dropping over 200,000 tons of explosives on Germany every single month. Aircraft losses were certainly high, the toll paid in young lives was terrible, but American production, those endless hangars full of bombers they had already seen with their own eyes, made the losses sustainable in a way that German losses could never be. Germany, meanwhile, could not replace the fuel being destroyed, or the machinery being smashed, or the skilled workers being killed. Every blast crater captured in these photographs represented another wound that would not heal, another piece of capacity that could not be recovered. The Reich was bleeding out under skies it could no longer control or defend. The sensory impact was undeniable even in still photographs examined under the fluorescent lights of a prisoner of war camp hall. The women studied the jagged white scars of bomb craters standing out against blackened earth, the skeletal remains of factories that had once hummed with machinery and bustling workers. One of them wrote in her diary that evening that she could almost smell the smoke rising from the paper itself, could almost hear the screams that must have accompanied these moments of destruction. What shook them most was the casualness with which the American officers presented these images. This was not theatre designed for the prisoners' benefit, not psychological warfare meant to break their spirits. It was routine analysis, the kind of material these officers sifted through every single day as part of their regular duties. To the prisoners, each photograph was a dagger to the heart. To the officers, it was just another intelligence report in a stack of thousands, interesting perhaps, but not particularly remarkable. One officer explained, without any apparent malice or gloating in his voice, that they did not need to destroy everything in Germany to win the war. They only needed to target the fuel, the ball bearings, the bridges, the transportation hubs. When those critical nodes were gone, German armies could not move, aircraft could not fly, tanks could not roll. His words were clinical in their precision, delivered in the tone of an engineer discussing a technical problem, but to the prisoners listening, they carried the weight of inevitable doom. Ingrid wrote afterward in her diary that it was not hatred that was defeating Germany, not some irrational fury or desire for revenge. It was arithmetic, cold calculation, the simple mathematics of production capacity and resource allocation. America could afford to lose bombers because it built them faster than they could be shot down. Germany could not afford to lose factories because there was no way to replace them once they were destroyed. The paradox was stark and impossible to ignore. German propaganda had painted America as reckless and chaotic, a nation of soft people incapable of discipline or sustained effort. Yet what these women were seeing in photograph after photograph was cold, disciplined precision, a systematic dismantling of their nation's ability to wage war. When the session finally ended and the prisoners were allowed to return to their barracks, they walked under a sky streaked with contrails from aircraft passing overhead at high altitude. For the first time since their capture, they felt as though even the clouds belonged to the enemy, as though the very sky had been conquered and there was nowhere left to hide from the truth of their situation. The Reich had told them the skies were theirs, that German air superiority would protect the homeland. The reality was written in smoke and destruction across hundreds of photographs, and it could no longer be denied. But this new knowledge carried with it a moral dilemma that gnawed at them during quiet moments. Should they keep silent when they returned home, protecting the comfortable illusions their country still clung to? Or should they speak truthfully about what they had seen, risking accusations of betrayal and defeatism? That question would come to a head with the arrival of a letter, one that would test both their own loyalty and the Americans' willingness to let prisoners confront uncomfortable truths about the war. The letter arrived on a grey afternoon, slipped under the door of the barracks like some kind of contraband. Hildegard, the nurse, discovered it first, picking up the envelope and turning it over in her hands with suspicion. It bore no official stamp or marking, only faint pencil scrawl across one corner that might have been a name or might have been nothing. When she unfolded the paper inside, the other women crowded around her like moths drawn to flame, pressing close to read over her shoulder. The message had come from another German prisoner of war camp somewhere else in the United States, smuggled through a network of prisoners who had managed to find ways to communicate despite the restrictions and distances. The text was short, written in hurried German script that was barely legible in places. It urged them to hold fast, claiming that the Reich was pushing back successfully on all fronts, that new weapons under development would change the course of the war, that they should not believe what the Americans were showing them because victory was still near and still possible. The words echoed all the same promises they had heard before their capture, the same reassurances that had sustained them through years of war. Yet now, after everything they had witnessed in the harbour and the hangars and the photographs, these sentences rang hollow, desperate in a way that was impossible to ignore. The letter's tone of desperation spoke louder than its actual words. Lotta, the radio operator, shook her head slowly and said that if Germany were truly winning on all fronts, they would not need to write letters like this one, would not need to plead with prisoners to keep faith. But Hildegard pressed the paper flat on the table, her expression troubled, pointing out that this message represented what their families were being told back home, the lies being fed to people who had no way of knowing better. What if those they loved believed these empty promises while they sat here knowing something entirely different? The tension in the barracks thickened as they debated among themselves. Their lives in this camp had already become defined by paradox. They were treated better by their captors than they had been by their own government. They were fed regularly while their families back home faced starvation rations. They were shown truths that contradicted everything the Reich's propaganda machine had ever told them. Now this letter threatened to drag them back into the shadows of belief, to make them question whether what they had witnessed with their own eyes was somehow less real than the promises written on this scrap of paper. That evening, an American lieutenant, who had been one of the officers showing them the bombing photographs, came to address the women in their barracks. He had the smuggled letter in his hand, clearly intercepted by camp security before or after it reached them. Speaking in halting but clear German, he told them they did not have to believe anything he said or anything the Americans showed them. But they should know, he continued, that what they were being shown was not lies or propaganda. America did not need to fabricate anything because the truth itself was overwhelming enough. He then laid a fresh set of photographs on the table where they gathered. These images were even more recent than the ones from weeks before. Rail depots throughout the industrial Ruhr reduced to rubble. Columns of smoke from Hamburg that seemed to stretch into the sky forever, the city burning for days after a massive raid. The contrast between the smuggled letter's optimistic promises and these stark images could not have been sharper or more brutal. For the first time in weeks, one of the prisoners who had remained almost completely silent since capture finally spoke up. Her name was Greta, and she had worked in weapons development before being captured near the French border. She looked at the photographs and then at the letter, and her voice when she spoke was firm and clear. If Germany truly possessed such miraculous new weapons, she asked, then why were they not stopping this? She tapped the photograph showing Hamburg in flames, her finger pressing hard against the paper. The question hung in the air unanswered because there was no good answer to give. The letter promised salvation through superweapons and wonder technologies, but the photographs showed the reality of systematic destruction that no amount of wishful thinking could reverse or deny. As the weeks continued and spring approached, American guards began allowing more controlled visits into nearby towns under heavy escort. The contrast between propaganda and reality would deepen until denial became impossible, even for those who desperately wanted to cling to belief. They would see American civilians going about their lives with an ease that mocked every claim about a nation stretched to breaking point by war. And slowly, inexorably, the truth would become inescapable. Spring of 1945 brought with it a peculiar kind of silence that settled over the camp like morning fog. The barracks that had once buzzed with rumours and arguments and disbelief grew quieter with each passing day. Newspapers were left deliberately in common rooms by American officers who clearly wanted the prisoners to read them, and each new headline announced the fall of another German city: Cologne, Dresden, Frankfurt, Munich. Each name was like a nail being driven into the coffin of certainty, hammering home the reality that the war was ending and not in Germany's favour. By April, whispers reached even these isolated prisoners. The Führer was dead. The man who had promised a 1,000-year Reich had taken his own life in a bunker beneath Berlin, rather than face the consequences of defeat. The empire that was supposed to last a millennium had collapsed in barely 12 years, and the women sat on their wooden bunks staring at one another, unable to reconcile the world they had been raised in with the world they now saw crumbling around them like a building with rotten foundations. Ingrid, still keeping her careful diary despite everything, wrote one evening that they had come to America as soldiers of a nation that believed itself destined to rule Europe, perhaps destined to rule the world. Now she could see that they had been nothing more than children fed stories and fairy tales, while America had been quietly building a world beyond their comprehension, beyond anything propaganda had prepared them to encounter. The United States Army began making preparations for repatriating the prisoners, sending them back to a homeland most of them no longer recognized. The women were issued clean uniforms to replace the worn clothes they had arrived in, subjected to final medical checkups to ensure they were fit for travel, and given rations to sustain them during the voyage across the Atlantic. Some wept openly at the thought of seeing family members again after months or years of separation. Others feared what awaited them in a defeated and starving Germany where cities lay in ruins and the social order had completely collapsed. For all of them, the journey home carried a haunting paradox they could not escape. They were leaving behind comfort and order in the land of their enemy, returning to chaos and devastation in their homeland. Before their departure, a Red Cross officer approached Ingrid privately with a decision she had to make. She could carry a message home if she chose, not a personal letter to family, but an official report to German authorities about what she had witnessed during her captivity. The idea had been debated in Washington at high levels. Would her words be dismissed immediately as enemy propaganda? Or could they serve as credible proof of the absolute futility of any continued resistance? Ingrid's account, when she finally wrote it, was brief but unflinching in its honesty. "America's strength is not a fabrication or an illusion," she wrote. "It is everywhere you look, in their machines, in their factories, in their food supplies, in their unity of purpose. To continue fighting this war is not courage, it is madness, and it will only bring more suffering to those who can least afford it." When the ship carrying them finally docked at Bremerhaven, the port barely recognizable from the rubble and destruction that surrounded it, her report was dutifully sent up through the chain of command. The reaction was entirely predictable. German officers who received it dismissed the document outright, labeling her either a traitor who had been broken by captivity or a gullible woman who had been seduced by American propaganda and trickery. The truth was simply too large to fit into their shrinking ideology, too overwhelming to accept without admitting that everything they had believed and fought for had been built on delusions. But for the women themselves, the women who had made this journey and seen what they had seen, the truth could not be erased or explained away, no matter how desperately others might try. They had witnessed aircraft rolling off assembly lines faster than combat could destroy them. They had eaten meals more substantial than what their own soldiers received at the front. They had walked through streets where children played without fear of air raids, where shops still had goods to sell, where people still smiled and laughed as though war was something happening far away to other people. What they carried back across the Atlantic was not just memory, though the memories would stay with them for the rest of their lives. They carried comparison, a living contradiction to everything the Reich had ever promised its people. They had been told America was soft and weak, but they had seen hardness in the form of productive capacity that dwarfed anything Germany could dream of achieving. They had been told Americans were divided and selfish, but they had seen unity in the coordinated effort of millions of workers building toward a common purpose. They had been told American democracy made it weak, but they had seen strength in a system that could mobilize total war while still feeding its people and maintaining civil liberties that Germans had lost years ago. Years and decades later, some of these women would tell their children and grandchildren about that surreal journey to America during the war. They did not speak of it as a story of humiliation, though there was certainly humiliation in it. They spoke of it as an awakening, a moment when the veil was pulled back and they were forced to see reality as it actually was, rather than as they had been told it should be. They recalled with perfect clarity the clang of shipyard hammers that never stopped, the endless rows of tanks waiting to be shipped overseas, the casual freedom of speech they overheard in cafes and on street corners where people criticized their own government without fear of midnight arrests. These were impressions that no photograph or propaganda film could erase, memories burned into their minds with the permanence of scars. They had arrived as prisoners of a regime that called itself invincible. that had convinced itself it could never be defeated by mere material superiority. They left as witnesses to its fundamental delusion, carrying knowledge that made them uncomfortable for the rest of their lives. And in the end, they came to understand that it was not America's bombs that had most profoundly unsettled them during those months of captivity. It was America's abundance, its relentless capacity to create rather than merely destroy, and its stubborn refusal to bow to the kind of scarcity that the Reich had come to accept as inevitable. This was not propaganda or theatre. This was reality, observable and undeniable. They had come expecting to find weakness and instead found a strength so overwhelming that it seemed casual in its application. In the final accounting, America's greatest weapon had not been its technology or its soldiers, though both were formidable. Its greatest weapon had been proof, simple, undeniable proof, that freedom, when matched with industrial capacity and national will, could outbuild and outlast any tyranny that relied on force alone to maintain itself. The lesson was there in every ship launched, every aircraft assembled, every meal served in that prisoner of war camp, and it was a lesson that could not be unlearned no matter how much someone might want to forget it.